nerds! So every other week or so on the LarpHouse, I'm going to post a tutorial that LARPers can use to make their character more visually interesting and their LARPing experience more immersive. This week we are doing a tutorial about Pros-Aide transfers. Pros-Aide transfers are a makeup prosthetic appliance that is made out of the medical grade adhesive that makeup artists usually use to attach makeup appliances.
So this is an example of a look that you can get with these Pros-Aide transfers, and you can laugh and you can cry and they'll stay on all day.
So let it be noted that you will need at least a whole day dedicated to making these, but once you put that whole day in, you can just put the material in the mold, pop it in the freezer and the dehydrator, and you can make more whenever you want, and it's super simple. So let's take a look at the materials you will need. A glass plate for sculpting on. You will need a Sharpie, tongue depressors for days, little white cups for measuring, larger plastic cups for mixing, 91 or 99% alcohol, scrap rag. We use Ease Release 205, it is from Smooth On, baby powder, a plastic cup with a lid. I use specimen cups because they're cheap and they come in bulk. A powder brush, Johnson's paste wax, and a brush to go with that. Wet clay or modeling clay. The only difference, this is water-based, and this is, well, it's not water-based, it keeps forever. Sculpting tools, Rust-Oleum lacquer for sealing your sculpture, and we get on to mold making supplies, which are silicone pigments, Smooth On Silk Pig. You can use Rebound 25 silicone or Mold Star silicone. You will need, for mold making, hot glue and plenty of sticks and cardboard strips. And for the actual material, you will need Pros-Aide or Pros-Aide cream, coloring for your material. I use Maron makeup. Some people will say to use acrylic paint. Don't f***ing do that. Flocking, little fabric fibers. They're used to color and add thickness to your material. You can get away with getting it in your skin tone and probably red, but it looks a little bit more real if you add different colors. If you don't want to do the whole mixing of the prosthetic material part, we sell, not in this same, we're not going to send you pea cups full of them, but we sell Pros-Aide prosthetic transfer material on our Etsy store. You will also need High Bond Cavasil if you want to mix your own. It's a silicone thickening and deadening agent. And last but not least, the transfer paper. This is Tinsley transfer paper. It's usually used for making temporary tattoos, but we use it for small makeup appliances. It is also known as, this is silicone treated acetate, and this is just the paper with the release on it. This stuff is a pain in the butt to find online, so we also sell this on the Etsy store. We also have our dehydrator. The total in shipping was about like $60. I use the Presto Dehydro Food Dehydrator. It's pretty great. The button on mine has caved in, but you know, it's only one button, one setting, so you can just plug it in and unplug it when you want to turn it off and on. This is not necessary. You can just leave your Pros-Aide transfers out to dry for multiple days. So if you buy the materials using the links below in our description, it really helps us out at no additional cost to you. So let's get started. Hello and welcome to the tutorial portion of LarpHouse. I am Cheyenne Rain and this is Madison Mojica. She is my makeup navigator. Today we are sculpting Pros-Aide transfers, and I will be sculpting in wet clay, which is a water-based clay. Madison will be sculpting in modeling clay so that you can see both techniques. So the first thing you do is get your throat cutting wires and cut yourself a piece of clay, and that's a huge piece, so I'm going to thin it down. And I found that scrapey tool is the perfect size for a forehead prosthetic. Any bigger than that, and you will need a bald cap, and that is a pain.
It is a pain. What I'm doing in the back there is just rolling out some of the modeling clay because it's slightly easier to work with once it's warmed up. And you usually don't have to cut it with throat cutting wire. You can just tear off a piece and start working.
Always use reference. This is my reference for my scales. You want to use real life references. Don't use drawings and don't use other people's prosthetics. If you use other people's prosthetics, it's like painting a picture of another painting. You don't learn anything, and you can always tell.
And you also lose a considerable amount of that real life detail if you're copying someone else's.
Exactly, because someone has already gone through a filtering process for you. What I'm doing here is starting to smooth out my edges while trying to keep the size consistent. I'm just going with a wet chip brush in an outward motion. Chip brushes are great because they're coarse and they kind of act like a sandpaper for wet clay. And smoothing wet clay down with water is super easy.
Yeah, the downside to modeling clay is that this entire time I've been smoothing it down with alcohol. Isopropyl alcohol is the best, but you can also use, what was I using?
91%.
91 is acceptable. Because I know that unless you go to makeup stores, 99% is hard to find.
Another fun thing about wet clay is that it will dry out your hands, so get some lotion or something for yourself afterwards. The size is pretty good on that one, so I'm starting with the cheek pieces, and I literally just use my fingers to measure the area of my cheek that I want covered, and then I just try to keep it consistent with that on the prosthetics. And I just put a white piece of paper under my sculpture so that I can see the edges better.
What's like the most common injury that you get asked to do?
Scars.
Scars?
It's mostly scars, because in LARP, people are more focused on the scar than they are the wound for their character.
Yeah, because they're usually old.
I'm starting work on a second piece. I'm just making a bunch of really small sculptures that would be useful for any NPC role in LARP. I've made like a cult rune thing because for some reason cults are always a problem.
Yeah, there's always some evil magic that needs, for some reason, to be carved into people's skin in LARP, so
Yep.
a couple of those wounds are really handy.
Yeah, and I think now I'm doing some, like, pustules and boils for the plague, because plague is also a thing.
There's always some kind of plague. And what I am doing now is I'm stippling with the chip brush to add some skin texture to the edges, because you don't want perfectly smooth edges. The more texture you have, usually the better, because people's skin is messed up.
Yep.
And the chip brush is great because a little bit of clay builds up on the brush, so it makes it the
there's
texture
the
better.
alcohol.
Yeah. So instead of water, you use alcohol, like we said before, on modeling clay.
On any sulfur-free based modeling clay. Because sulfur-free is important.
There's some close-up of some skin texture that you get with stippling and brushing with just a chip brush. And then we've got the general shape. I'm probably going to have to redo this once I start carving in the scales, but just to show you.
Oh, there's mine.
There's a nice wound.
I, redid that thing, several times during this whole video.
But the skin texture is really nice on it.
Yeah. I just wasn't happy with the shape, and that'll happen. Sometimes you'll just have to redo a sculpture over and over until you're happy with it.
Mm-hmm. Alright, so here I am just using a softer brush than the chip brush to clean around the edges, because you don't want a whole bunch of gunk around there. And I'm using a softer brush because it's kind of more like a squeegee effect.
Yeah, I'm kind of doing a little bit in the back there with, again, isopropyl alcohol instead of water. Because you definitely, once you get to the casting part, you want the surface around the sculpture to be clean.
Yeah, I'm doing this because my edges are nice and mostly finished, so really what I'm doing next is going to be carving a bunch of scales for hours. So we took a break and I placed a slightly damp paper towel over mine to keep it from completely drying out, and now it is an okay hardness for carving for scales. So, getting my reference back out, I have made these prosthetics actually quite a lot thicker than I would make a normal prosthetic, because I'm going to be carving into it, and I'm putting little ridges in. So I've marked where I'm going to put those, and I just begin carving. I use a reductive method for carving scales. Some people like to shape the scales and then attach them and build them up that way. It's complete personal preference. I find that it's easier to manage if you just carve them. And I use the little spade tool that comes in the basic clay working kit that we'll have linked in the description. But it's really great for smoothing and getting those fine points.
And I've started work on more plague boils, I think, in the back there. And also redoing that rune carving, because I continued to not be happy with it for the 12 hours that we shot this until the very end.
So you see me using a brush every now and again. That's just to get rid of the excess little bits, and also that smooths out the scale slightly. It gets rid of tiny imperfections. So I'm just kind of smoothing it out as I go.
Yeah, I think I started work on the knife slice wound in the back there at this point. Also, in retrospect, I shouldn't have sculpted all of those things super close, because it ended up making the molds too close for comfort. So keep an eye on the spaces between your prosthetics if you're making more than one.
So what I'm doing here is using my weird, I don't know what that tool is called, but I have attached the little ridges that a lot of lizards have. I don't know what they're called, but ridges. And I'm just using that tool to smooth them in. And then again using the brush to smooth it out even more.
And for the wound in the back there, if you're not squeamish, it is always really good, especially for any kind of lifelike wound, to look at real-life references. Depending on what you're carving, they can be awful, so just be aware of that. Luckily, I have a stronger stomach, so I've seen some really awful things. But for a simple cut or something, you just want to make sure that you have a clear, visible split between the skin layer and the muscle tissue on the inside.
What I found is good for the sculpting process of sculpting a wound is if you take, also this helps if you're a little bit squeamish, is if you take a picture of a wound and make it black and white, it makes it easier to see the relief of the whole thing without being distracted by the color.
That's a really good idea. Scales for days.
And I'm making the scales blend into the skin. I don't want just like skin and then all of a sudden a fully formed scale. I want it to blend better. So yeah, I'm making them tinier towards the edge, and
yeah, that's definitely a good idea to keep in mind. If you want the prosthetic to blend naturally, Like, make sure that if you're doing something like scales, you fade them into the skin, or if you're doing something like the plague boils, you, like, build it up towards the middle and leave the edges kind of flat, so it doesn't look like suddenly there's a bump on your face.
Exactly. I'm using just really soft, really subtle carving marks around the edge, and then getting deeper towards the middle of the prosthetic where the kind of transformation is more complete. And even the size of the scales are bigger towards the center. And I am, you just saw me wet the edges there, because with wet clay, the edges, since they're so thin, will dry out faster than the rest of the piece. So you want to keep your edges moist.
Yeah.
Because the problem with wet clay is that when it dries, it shrinks. And if it shrinks, it ruins everything. So do not let it dry out completely. And again, it's important to let it dry to where you can touch it and not leave a fingerprint. It's kind of a fine line. Too dry and it shrinks, and too wet and it will be impossible to carve. It's like trying to carve mud. It's not going to work out.
Yeah.
You're going to have a bad time.
Have a bad time. It's not that difficult to get a hang of it, though. Once you
Nah.
actually, like, have the material in hand, you'll see what we're talking about.
Yeah. So I have in my hands like a chip brush as well as a smooth brush, and I'm adding skin texture around the edges now, where it was lost from the carving. And smooth it out slightly, because pores aren't really holes, they're more indents. So you don't want to have like just a hole, really.
I mean, you can, but
You
most
can,
people
but-
don't have gaping pores.
Exactly.
So it might look a little strange if you're doing a more human-like piece, like a wound or something, but if you're doing some kind of weird creature, then that should be fine.
And what I've just done is I put a paper towel over my cheek pieces and I sealed the forehead piece because it is done and I do not want it to dry out while I carve the cheek pieces. And that's just Rust-Oleum lacquer. You can use pretty much any acrylic lacquer or glaze. Whatever you use, make sure it is sulfur-free. That is the big one.
Sulfur-free is kind of clear. Is not clear. The main point is like sulfur-free. That's the main. Oh, look at my veins. I did some veins and a brow ridge thing and just a whole bunch of different things that Cheyenne and anybody who helps out with makeup for LARP behind the scenes for NPCs would be able to use. And Cheyenne killed one of my prosthetics right there.
I did. And I will probably feel guilty about that forever.
No.
But what we're doing here is adding the flashing. This is basically where when you put your material into the prosthetic, this is where the runoff gathers.
Yeah, it gives you a nice blending edge, which is super important.
Yeah.
A blending edge just will help it blend into the skin better and make it look like it's not a prosthetic.
Yeah.
And you want... So one of the super important things about the flashing wall is that you don't want it to be super far away to the prosthetic, but you also want to make sure that you leave room for that nice blending edge. So about, like, I don't know, what did I do? Like a little less than
It's like-
half an inch.
Yeah.
A little less than half an inch. Like,
the width of a pinky nail, really.
yeah, the
is
width of a
good.
pinky nail, the width of a nail in general is, you're not gonna have a bad time. And I actually built mine up too high.
Now we have about 5 molds to make. 5 mold boxes. 4? 4. 5. It's 5. 1, 2, 3. No, 4. It's 4.